Hey there, vinyl community. I'm back today to renew a series that I started last year. And that is, of course, when I go through and listen to and review all of my RCA living stereo records by catalog number. And today that brings us to a couple early gems of French repertoire performed by what was at the time this country's premier orchestra known for playing French repertoire, and that's the Boston Symphony Orchestra conducted by Charles Munch. And the first record I'm going to talk about today is LSC 1893, the complete Daphnis and Chloe ballet. This, what I'm holding, is an Analog Productions reissue. It's not the original Shaded Dog, but this was actually recorded in 1955 in Boston Symphony Hall and not released until 1960, 2 years after stereo records came out. But this is one of the original series of two-track recordings that the RCA Living Stereo team did in the early and mid-50s. I actually listened to this record earlier this year when I was reviewing the new Ravel Orchestral Works box set by Seiji Ozawa and the Boston Symphony that's put out on the original Source series from Deutsche Grammophon. But it was kind of nice to revisit it by itself outside of the context of comparing a lot of different recordings, because this is a symphony I should say, it's a ballet, but this is a piece of music that is recorded a lot. Most major orchestras have done this many times. Most conductors have recorded this multiple times. But I think it's something special because this piece of music was the Boston Symphony Orchestra's bread and butter for a very long time. It's one of the pieces they are definitely known for. So, for those not familiar with Daphnis and Chloe, it's one of those old Greek mythological legends that Ravel set to a choreographic symphony, and it actually includes a part for chorus without words. And it was written in 1912, and at coming in just under an hour, it's actually one of Ravel's longest works. And this is a piece that rises and falls and swells and crests over like almost like a wave. There are melodies in this, but it is not what you think of when you think of a melodic work. There's a lot of almost colors that you perceive when listening to this, rather than specific melodic lines. But there are some standout melodies in this, particularly the beautiful flute solo that's definitely one of the biggest flute excerpts out there. And in this recording and the later Munch recording that he would redo for Living Stereo, as well as the Ozawa recording, we get some wonderful flute playing by BSO principal flutist Dorrit Dwyer, who was, if I understand correctly, the first major female, the first female principal wind of any of the major orchestras in North America at the time. She joined the Boston Symphony, I think, in 1952 and stayed there as principal flute until 1990. So I've heard a lot of different versions of her solo in the second part of Daphnis, but it's captured beautifully on this disc. There's so many things that are captured so well in the naturalness of this recording. I think this is one of the better efforts of the early RCA team at capturing the Boston Symphony in Boston Hall. I won't do a direct comparison to the Ozawa box, because that was also, the Ozawa recording was also recorded with the same orchestra in Boston Symphony Hall about 15 years later. The one thing I will say that's a major difference, because I think they're both hi-fi recordings, they're both very impressive recordings. This has a naturalness and an openness that the Ozawa recording, recorded by Deutsche Grammophon, does not have. And it's important for this piece because there is an ease at which this piece has to flow, and if there is too much hardness, especially in the strings, you lose some of that magical, mystical effect that I think this piece requires. And the crescendos and the opening kind of flutter of the woodwinds and the lush string tone in this recording, I think, is absolutely gorgeous. And it's something that if you have a really properly set up system with a lot of transparency in it, this will sound really, really magical. So I wish I had an original Shaded Dog to compare to this, but I've been so impressed by the Analog Production series that this is in print for $40. I highly recommend checking this out because of the Boston records, I think this is probably one of the better ones I've heard. Now, Charles Munch did record this piece with the BSO for Living Stereo twice. He actually recorded it again in 1961. So this actually didn't stay in the catalog long, which is why original pressings of this, while you can find them, they're a little more rare. They're not one of the common Living Stereos you see in the bins. You're much more likely to find LSC 2568, which is the one that Munch recorded in 1961. It came out, even though they were recorded 6 years apart, it came out just 1 year after this one. So it replaced it in the catalog. Now, I haven't heard that record on vinyl. I know the recording itself is very highly respected. And of the two Munch recordings, you're probably good with either one. However, this one has been reissued. AP or Classic have not reissued the 1961 recording. So I think if you want a gorgeous original two-track recording of this piece, this is the way to go. And I think, despite the fact that I've reviewed the Ozawa very highly when I wrote it up on Tracking Angle, and I'll link that review down below, there's just too many good versions of this piece out there. You have both Munch's efforts with the BSO. You have an excellent recording done by Ozawa with the BSO in the 70s. And then in the 80s, you get this wonderful recording by Charles Dutoit in the Montreal Symphony, which has a very, very different sound to it. And I'm not going to do a direct comparison, but I think all of those are worth hearing. Oh, and then you have the Montu with the London Symphony Orchestra. And Montu, of course, premiered this piece way back in, what was it, 1912? And then he stuck around to record it again in the, I think, late 50s. But Munch with the BSO is a safe bet. And there's definitely some differences in the interpretation. At this time, Munch had perfected with the BSO this lightness in the string sound, this lightness in the woodwind playing. It was very French. This comes from the fact that in the early 20th century, a lot of the BSO players were actually French immigrants, were French musicians that came over in between the two world wars. So there's a long tradition of the French school of orchestral playing in the Boston Symphony. And when you compare this musically to the Ozawa from the 70s, listen, they are both fantastic recordings. Both conductors have a great command of the piece. The playing is superb. I think even the playing is a little more refined in the Ozawa than it is in the BSO, in the 50s BSO recording. But you do hear a difference in the orchestral sound. There is a little more of a French style, that lightness, especially in the strings and the violins. There is more of that lightness, that swiftness in the playing from the 50s here that was starting to fade by the time you got to the 70s. Before I move on, I want to read off what Jonathan Valen has to say about this recording in the RCA Bible. And he says, LSC 1893, although TP recommends the Chesky, which is saying something because, like most of us, TP doesn't like Cheskys, I think the Shaded Dog is outstanding. Ravishing tone, superb transparency, and a level of fine detail and shading within string choirs that is nothing short of exquisite. This is one of those records, and they are rare enough on any label, in which recording technique serves the performance so perfectly that the result truly does illuminate the music. And I do agree with this review. Now, again, he's talking about an original Shaded Dog, and I'm talking about the Analog Productions reissue, but I have a hard time believing that an original pressing is going to beat this wonderful remaster that Ryan K. Smith was able to do at Sterling Sound. And to my knowledge, this is still in print, although some of the RCA titles from Chad at Acoustic Sounds, some of those are starting to go out of stock, but last I checked, I think this is still available. Everyone's got to have one version of this piece in their catalog. I think this is a strong contender for that one if you have to have one. The next record I want to talk about is another Munch Boston recording of very, very standard French repertoire. And it's Berlioz Symphony Fantastique. The catalog number is LSC 1900, and I'm going to show it right here. This is an interesting recording because I want to say this was also recorded around the same time as Daphnis and Chloe, around 55, maybe 56. But it was listed in the official RCA catalog that was issued in 1960. LSC 1900, Berlioz Symphony Fantastique, Charles Munch and the Boston Symphony. But it never saw the light of day. And I'll read to you what Jonathan Valen talks about in this placeholder in the RCA Bible. The official RCA catalog issued July 1st, 1960, lists this disc in stereo. No one has ever seen a Shaded Dog stereo copy, however. If you find one, call me. There is a dealer in New York City who has a standing offer of $15,000 for this disc. Do know that there is a for real stereo version of this disc in a gold seal issue, AGL 2706, which is itself something of a collector's item. So, this is one that RCA, I think, had every intention of issuing, and it just never happened. This stereo recording would eventually get issued in 1980 on RCA Gold label. That's not a record I've heard. So, what I'm holding here is a Classic Records reissue, because the stereo tape did exist. It was issued in mono. And then, just like Daphnis and Chloe, Munch would record this again. It was actually one of the final recordings he did before he left the Boston Symphony, but he would record it again in 1962, and that was issued by RCA Living Stereo in 1962. So, like Daphnis and Chloe, there are 2 Munch recordings in stereo of this piece, and the later stereo recording done in 1962 is a very common Shaded Dog that you can find at a lot of used bins. But there was no original issue of LSC 1900, the original 2-track recording done by Munch. So Classic Records reissued this. And what's interesting is they reissued it in a couple different covers. What I'm holding here is the 33 RPM reissue they did using, this is a painting of like images of a ball, it looks like. But you also have some things like you see a little bit of a hint of clarinet key here and things like that. But there's another cover they used for the 45 RPM edition, which is a kind of a freaky painting of like a multi-headed sunflower. I will show that up on the screen. Anyway, originally for the longest time, I've had the 33 RPM reissue of this by Classic Records. I think it sounds excellent. I don't, in going back and listening to this, because it's been a while since I listened to this and my system has changed a lot, I don't think this is quite as transparent or as solid in the recording quality as the Daphnis and Chloe recording. That has a lot more solidity to me. And this has that beautiful organic string tone that these early 2-track living stereos tend to have. But there's just a little bit more opaqueness, especially in the low brass and the percussion. It's still excellent, but I did notice that difference. Now, after owning this for a few years, I did eventually get some of the 45 RPM versions that Classic did. And Classic did these as single-sided 45 RPM, so there's 4 discs in this set, single-sided LPs. And the only one I'm missing is disc number 1, which has the cover on it with the sunflowers. But what I have is disc 2, 3, and 4. So of this symphony, I have movements 2, 3, 4, and 5, but I don't have the first movement at 45 RPM. But it was kind of interesting comparing these different versions. Now, before I go on about the recording, I want to talk a little bit about Symphony Fantastique, because like Daphnis and Chloe, I think it's one of those pieces that everyone should have a copy of in their collection. As much as I love the Ravel, Symphony Fantastique, I think, is a monumental piece in the classical canon. To give you some context, Beethoven's Symphony No. 9, that was premiered in 1824. Symphony Fantastique was premiered in 1830 by the French composer Hector Berlioz. There is such a monumental difference in composition between Beethoven, who represented the beginning of the Romantic movement, but he still had a lot of classical style in his composition, and then moving to Hector Berlioz, who ushered in the Middle Romantic period. Symphony Fantastique is a programmatic work. Berlioz wrote program notes to it, and if you go in listening to this piece with the program notes in mind, you'll realize it really does tell a story, and it's quite a wild story. He wrote it as almost a semi-autobiographical piece dedicated to a ballet dancer he was, ballet or opera singer, I can't remember. I think ballet dancer he was a little bit infatuated with. He wrote this piece about an artist who becomes obsessed with another young artist, a young lady, and he goes into an opium-induced haze And the symphony, the 5-movement symphony, tells the story of first, you have the opening movement, the scene where basically his love is kindled. You have the second movement that is the ball, where he sees her at the ball, and the dance, the waltz gets more and more out of control. And then you have the third movement, the pastoral scene, and it opens with, and I played this piece a couple times, both the principal oboe part and the English horn part. What happens is, in the opening of the third movement, you have an offstage oboe solo with an onstage English horn solo. And the onstage English horn solo represents the main character, Berlioz, or the composer in the story. And the offstage oboe solo represents his beloved. They are far away, but there is that longing in that vision, and they play this little duet that goes back and forth, the offstage oboe and the onstage English horn. And that gives way to a pastoral scene that's played through the rest of the movement. At the end of the third movement, the oboe is no longer off stage. The English horn plays the melody, expecting the oboe to answer, but the oboe doesn't answer. There is no oboe part in the final bars of the third movement. Instead, the English horn plays alone, and it realizes it's alone. The only other instrument playing at this time is the timpani, giving this ominous roll. It's like the doom, because he can't see his beloved anymore. He can't see his infatuation. And he's slipping into this kind of delirious opium-induced haze. This is pretty much in the program notes that Berlioz himself wrote for this piece. A wild thing to write in 1830. And then you have the fourth and the fifth movement, which are some of the... this would have been wild if it was written in 1870, but it was written in 1830. So then you have the fourth movement, the march to the scaffold, because in his delirium, the composer either did or believes he murdered his crush. He murdered the young woman. And so he's stood trial, and he's being marched to the scaffold for his execution. And it's weird. It's this like demented heroic march. It sounds heroic. He's like celebrating his march to the scaffold. And then there's even a moment where you hear the guillotine go down and you hear the head roll. It's in the string pizzicato. You hear the head bounce down the steps after he's executed. And then the fifth movement. The fifth movement is the dream of the witch's Sabbath. It's full hallucination at this point. But he is in hell and watching a witch's Sabbath, and it's got all this demented instrumentation, incredibly loud brass. You have the Dies Irae melody, which is throughout the movement, which is like a funeral melody. It's an old plain chant that often is associated with death in the underworld. And these kind of demonic. There's a very unnerving high E-flat clarinet solo in the beginning of the movement that I find just bone-chilling. So this is a thrilling symphony. And it really, it's so important because it created a craze when it premiered. It launched Berlioz as a composer on the world stage. It really moved the Romantic movement forward. It moved Romanticism forward into more programmatic music. You could not have Wagner or Liszt or anything like that without this symphony by Hector Berlioz. Now, like Daphnis and Chloe, there's so many good recordings of this piece out there, and it really can be a hi-fi showstopper. The high-fidelity recording of choice for this piece that comes to mind is the recently reissued Seiji Ozawa recording with the Boston Symphony on Deutsche Grammophon original source. But I think there's a lot of merit to this original Munch recording. The 33 RPM Classic Records version of this is very nice, but I did notice some big differences listening to the 45, which I think these 45 RPM living stereos are some of the best things Classic Records ever did. There is even a little more transparency, particularly in the string sound with the 45, but the big thing is the dynamics. The dynamic swells on this, especially in the final disc, the March to the Scaffold, the fourth movement, and the fifth movement, the Dream of the Witch's Sabbath. Everything is so much more composed when, the trombones really come in powerful on the fifth movement. They sound so much more physically real than on the 33. So if you really like hearing those differences, especially at the climax of large dynamic sections, yeah, of course the 45 is better. And it's why I want Analog Productions to reissue the 45 plates from this, because I know they own them. That would be just spectacular. And by the way, if anyone has record 1 from this set, please contact me, because I'd love to actually have a complete set of this and not just have records 2, 3, and 4. So if someone just has record 1 of this, please leave a comment or send me an email or something like that. But while I don't think the sound is as solid and maybe as hi-fi as the Daphnis and Chloe recording that was recorded about the same time, I think this is still one of the best recordings out there of Symphony Fantastique, and it's a joy to listen to. I'm glad Classic Records revived it, and I would love to see Analog Productions tackle this one, especially since they own the classic plates and they could reissue it as a double 45. I think that would be just spectacular. But what you have here is you have 2 of some of the earliest recordings Munch did for RCA Living Stereo with the Boston Symphony. You hear what is one of the best sounding orchestral halls, especially at this time, in the country. You hear it rendered beautifully in front of you, extending back beyond your system. These 2-track recordings really capture that. And it's just the most essential French repertoire, some of the most essential French repertoire you can have in your collection. No classical record collection is complete without Daphnis and Chloe and Symphony Fantastique. I think both of these recordings really show off the strengths of the BSO at this time, the strengths of Symphony Hall, and the strengths of this 2-track recording technique that the RCA engineers were using at the beginning of the stereo era. They sound magical. And if you've never heard these recordings before, they are really a window in time to when the Boston Symphony was at their height as a French orchestra in the Americas. I would recommend checking them out on streaming, but at the very least, Daphnis should be easy to pick up. And I think if you want to hunt down the 33 of Symphony Fantastique, I don't think it's going to be too hard to find. The next records in this series will be really fun. You have Tchaikovsky's Symphony No. 6, also with the BSO. And then we have one of the first living stereo Heifetz records, Brahms Violin Concerto. So those will be coming next time. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this little trip through early stereo Boston Symphony. And until next time, everyone, cheers.